is about shaping the future of the world we live in. Yet in many ways, it seems a hopeless endeavour, predicated upon the failure of our predecessors. Had they succeeded in shaping a future for us, then we would have nothing left to do save to fall in line with their imperatives. Likewise, were we to succeed in shaping the future for our successors, they in turn would become mere users, confined to the implementation of designs already made for them. Designs, it seems, must fail if every generation is to be afforded the opportunity to look forward to a future that they can call its own. Indeed, the very history of design could be understood as the cumulative record of concerted human efforts to put an end to it, an interminable series of final answers, none of which turns out in retrospect to be final after all. Or to adapt a maxim from the architectural writer Stuart Brand, all designs are predictions, all predictions are wrong. And this doesn't sound like a formula for sustainable living. Sustainability is not about projections and targets, or about the achievement of a steady state. It is about keeping life going. And yet design seems bent on bringing it to a stop by specifying moments of completion when the forms of things fall into line with what was initially intended for them. Sorry to repeat the line from yesterday's lecture, but I'm going to. Form is the end, death. This is the artist Paul Klee in his notebooks. Form giving is movement, action. Form giving is life. So by setting ends to things, doing not, as Klee intimates, kill them off. Its design brings predictability and foreclosure to a life process that is open-ended and improvisatory, then is not design the very antithesis of life? How, following Klee's example, might we shift the emphasis in design from form to form-giving? Or how, in other words, can we think of design as an aspect of a process of life whose primary characteristic is not that it is heading to a predetermined target, but that it carries on? Now, in this lecture, I call for such a rethinking. I want to argue that design, far from being the exclusive preserve of a class of professional experts tasked with the production of futures for the rest of us to consume, I want to argue that design is an aspect of everything we do, insofar as our actions are guided by hopes, dreams, and promises. That's to say, rather than setting the parameters for our habitation of the earth, design is part and parcel of the very process of dwelling. And it is, by the same token, about the ongoing creation of the kinds of environment in which dwelling can occur. That's what I mean by designing environments for life. So my aim is to come up with a kind of manifesto for such design. But to make a start, it's necessary to clear up certain confusions concerning what we mean by environment. And it's to this that I shall turn first. We live in an era, or so scientists, policymakers and statesmen like to tell us, we live in an era when the environment is under threat in a way that it has never been before. Changes in climate, largely induced by human activities, could render large areas of the earth uninhabitable. Now, I don't mean to deny this threat or to underestimate its scale, but I do want to question whether the so-called environment of scientific and policy discourses is one that human beings or any other creatures have ever inhabited. For what these discourses present to us is not the world we know from our everyday experience. Literally, of course, an environment is all around the person or organism whose environment it is. It is the phenomenal world that we perceive with our senses, including the earth beneath our feet, the sky arching above our heads, the air we breathe, not to mention the profusion of vegetation powered by the light of the sun, and all the animals that depend on it, busily absorbed in their own lives, as are we in ours. I would like to take you outdoors, into the open air, to remind you of this, since here, inside this lecture theatre, it seems to be something we can only imagine. It is, moreover, so fragile and imaginary that it is readily crushed by the high-powered impact and technologies of data projection that are designed to tell us things rather than to enhance our awareness or powers of observation. And what these technologies are telling us in conference rooms just like this, located all around the world, furnished with exactly the same equipment, with blinds drawn to cut out the light, and populated by globe-trotting international experts, is that the environment is not at all as I have just described it, or as we might find it if we were to take a walk outdoors. It is rather a world whose reality is given quite independently of our experience of it, and that we can know only through the compilation of data sets drawn from detached observation and measurement, and relayed back in the forms of maps, graphs, and images. It is apprehended as the globe with its atmosphere, rather than a manifold of earth and sky, as a catalogue of biodiversity, rather than the entangled life waves of animals and plants, as susceptible to climatic change, rather than the vicissitudes of weather. Now, for most people, the environment of everyday life is understood in the first sense. It is what we tend to call the world around us, extending from where we are to the horizon, with the earth below and the sky above. Yet it is the second sense that predominates in the discourses of technoscience and policymaking. From this latter perspective, the relation between people and the world seems to be turned inside out. When scientists and policymakers speak of the global environment, they have in mind a world that we have ourselves surrounded. Expelled to its outer surface, we have become ex-habitants rather than inhabitants. In a world conceived as a globe, as philosopher Martin Heidegger pointed out, there is nowhere for us humans to be. The earth affords habitation, the globe does not. And while we may accept some responsibility for the global environment, it is not something to which we feel we should belong. How then can we respond to the prognostications of science? How can we act to safeguard the future of a globalized world that, in our experience, has already been taken from us? I don't mean that we should turn a blind eye to the changes largely induced by human activity, which threaten the continuity of life in many regions of the planet. But I believe that the proper way to address this threat and to secure the continuity of a world fit for both humans and non-humans to live in is to close the gap that currently exists between the experienced environment of our everyday lives, that is, the world around us, and the projected environment of science and policy discourse. At present, it seems to me this gap is becoming ever wider. And for the discipline of anthropology, I'm an anthropologist, caught as it is betwixt these contrary understandings and committed to mediating between them, this poses an acute challenge. To begin to close the gap, the first step is to bring it out into the open and recognize that it exists. And the second is to acknowledge that the environment of lived experience is just as real, if not more so, than the one described by science, and that the wisdom, sensitivity, and judgment of inhabitants offers just as valid a basis for securing the continuity of life as do the models, predictions, and scenarios of scientists. Far from abandoning science, however, or opposing the knowledge of inhabitants to scientific knowledge, we need to find ways in which they can work together. And this calls for both a revaluation of the environmental experience and creative intervention of lay practitioners, and an acknowledgement that science and technology too are grounded in practices of habitation. Now at present, with rare exceptions, this is not happening. But the reasons for the failure are not philosophical, they are, I think, political. They lie in the overwhelmingly greater power of the neoliberal state and corporate industry to enlist institutionalized science in the pursuit of their global interests. Interests that, in the language of large corporations, more often than not pass under the rubric of sustainable development. The calculus of sustainability is one that treats entire tracts of the Earth's surface and the resources they harbour as standing reserves for the continuing benefit of a globally distributed humanity, much as one might administer a trust fund for future generations. It is to protect the Earth in the same way that the company protects its profits. This is not a question of personal care based on familiarity and experience, but of bookkeeping and rational management, of balancing recruitment and loss in renewables, just as one might balance monetary income and expenditure. In short, sustainability is premised upon a perspective of ex-habitation. By and large, the management of sustainability has made it more difficult, and not less, for the vast majority of people on the planet who have access neither to corporate power nor to the wealth that goes with it to inhabit the Earth. Their land, or their rights to use them, have in many cases been curtailed or confiscated. They have been divested of both the responsibility of care for their environment and of the power to exercise it. And their knowledge has been reduced to evidence, answering to systems of governance and regulation not of their own making, but imposed from above by more powerful interests. And so scientific and inhabitant knowledge occupy two poles in a hierarchy of power, with science at the top and inhabitants at the bottom. They're like two balls of an hourglass where the flow is unilaterally from the top down rather than the bottom up. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should invert the glass. Today, more than ever, our actions in the world need to be informed by a science of the environment. But we need to put the glass on one side, to give equal weight to the knowledge and wisdoms of both practicing environmental scientists and inhabitants. For scientists are inhabitants too. Their studies are not just of the environment, but are carried out in an environment. All science depends on observation, and observation depends on the same sensitivity and judgment in relation to the world around us that is key to the practices of inhabitants, be they scientists, farmers, foresters, fishers, hunters, or anyone else whose livelihoods are inextricably bound to the lands and oceans that are on Earth. So the rootedness of scientific inquiry in our habitation of the Earth, its general messiness and incoherence, is something to be celebrated, not suppressed. We need to turn the relation between people and environment back again from inside out to outside in. Only by doing so, by founding a science of the environment upon an ontological foundation that lets us be in the world we seek to know and understand, rather than expelling us from it, only then can scientific knowledge and the wisdom of inhabitants meet in the common project of designing environments for life. Now, before suggesting how this might be done, I need to say a few words about the meaning of life itself. Because my contention is that the same logic that has cast humans on the outside of the globe has put life inside the creatures that populate itself. Life has come to be identified with an interior principle installed from the moment of conception at the heart of every organism, whence it orchestrates that organism's growth and development in an environment. The essence of life, in short, is supposed to lie in the genes. And according to what many students are told is the first law of biology, every living thing is the product of an interaction between genes and environment. That is, between a received set of interior specifications, genotypes, and the exterior conditions of existence. Now, in a celebrated passage of The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin imagined himself observing, I quote, the plants and bushes clothing an entangled bank. And it's a compelling image. In the tangled bank, lines of growth issuing from multiple sources become comprehensively bound up with one another, just as do the vines and creepers of a dense patch of tropical forest, or the tangled root systems that you cut through with your spade every time you dig your garden. But it was not in these bindings, in these interweavings of trajectories of growth, that Darwin sought the unity of life. It was rather in the principle of common ancestry. And ever since Darwin, the mainstream scientific conception of the unity of life has been genealogical. It is said that we share our world with other creatures because, or to the extent that, we are related to them along lines of descent from putative common ancestors. When the primatologist James Woodhall famously shook hands with the chimpanzee David Graebier, the popular press proclaimed it as a handshake that spanned 5 million years. 5 million years ago, when the lines leading humans and chimpanzees was said to have diverged. I wonder how many million years you span quite unremarkably every time you stroke your hand. The answer, of course, and I don't know what it is irrelevant. The degree of relatedness or genetic connection has absolutely no bearing upon our material entanglements with fellow inhabitants of the life world, whether human or non-human. Conversely, these entanglements are of no consequence for a calculus of relatedness based on genetic connection. And thus, an understanding of the unity of life in terms of genealogical relatedness is bought at the cost of cutting out every single organism from the relational matrix in which it lives and grows. In this understanding, life presents itself to our awareness not as the interlacing of the tangled banks, but rather as an immense scheme of classification, nowadays going by the name of biodiversity, in which every individual is assigned to a specific taxon, species, or genus, on the basis of virtual attributes that it is deemed to possess by virtue of genetic transmission independently and in advance of its life in the world. Now, if the unity of life can be understood in genealogical terms only by treating every living thing as a virtual object, abstracted from the world's inhabitants, then how does modern thought understand the unity of the world? And I've already suggested the answer. To life excised from the world presents itself not as a ground of habitation, but as a surface to be occupied. We owe this possession to Immanuel Kant. The world, wrote Kant, is the substratum and the stage on which the play of our skills proceeds. So whereas in the chart of phylogenetic descent, living things are arrayed on the axis of time, on the surface of the world, they are arrayed on the coordinates of space, the first giving us the opposition between the particular and the general, the second, the opposition between the local and the global. Crucially, Kant supposed that while the mind identifies all possible objects by fitting them within the compartments of an overarching classification, It identifies all possible locations by fitting them into what he called an extended concept of the whole surface of the Earth that assumes this surface to be spherical in form. At once continuous and finite in extent, the spherical topology of the Earth's surface then comes to stand for the fundamental idea which the mind is said to bring to experience of the unity of the natural world. That's why, still today, the phylogenetic tree diagrams of biological taxonomy readily coexist with images of the world as a solid globe surrounded by space. In short, the mode of apprehension that would reveal the totality of living things as a catalogue of biodiversity is also one that reveals the world as a globe in the purview of a universal humanity. The tree and the globe are complementary images. Each indeed presupposes the other. Together, globe and tree make up the two great domains of nature, the inorganic and the organic, upon which humanity is said to have added the super-organic layer of society. Now, writing at the concept of society, the anthropologist Eric Wolf reminds us that it is far from a mere label under which we may subsume certain objective groupings of human beings or creatures of other species whose members are said to hold some common bond. Assertions about the existence of society and the manner of its constitution, as Wolf insists, are not simple statements of fact of the way things are. They are rather claims, advanced and enacted in order to construct a state of affairs that previously was not. Throughout the last few centuries of European and American history, numerous and often conflicting claims have been advanced in the name of society, each, however, motivated by a vision of future equilibrium that would finally balance the needs and desires of human individuals with their conditions of mutual coexistence. The ever-changing upshot of the coercive enactment of these claims, alternately murderous and monumental, is the messy world we now live in. It's a world where, rather as in a modern city, structures dating from different periods and driven by different finalities jostle for space while inhabitants pick their way as best they can between them, turning every closure into an opening for the continuation of their own life history. Of course, for as long as people have been carrying on in the company of others, social life has been proceeding, but it has not always proceeded under the rubric of society. What is perhaps most distinctive about life conducted under this rubric, society, is the experience of having to weave a path through a medley of structures built by others for you to live in, according to designs that answer not to your particular background and circumstances, but to some generalized conceptions of pan-human beings. For as Wolf says, the concept of society, wherever and whenever it has been unloosed upon the world, and this has always been at specific times and places, has been aggressive in its claim to universality for all times and everywhere. Now, my reason for introducing these reflections on society is that much of what applies to the concept also applies to the concept of nature. Indeed, the two concepts share a common history in which they have been often paired, whether as analogues or as opposites. But no more than the concept of society does nature signify the brute facticity of the world, or what is objectively out there, regardless of the endeavours and aspirations of those who have resort to the term. Assertions about the existence and constitution of nature as of society are claims, and the aggressive pursuit of these claims by agents with sufficient coercive power to impose their views can greatly affect the circumstances under which people have to lead their lives. These claims have been many and various, ranging from the original invocation of uncultivated commons as Carololius, which opened the door to the colonial expropriation of the lands of indigenous peoples, to the contemporary appeal of ecological restoration, which would see the landscape revert to some image of what it was before humans arrived on the scene. If there's a difference between claims advanced in the name of nature and those advanced in the name of society, it is that the former are more retrospective than prospective, more concerned to establish a universal point of origin for humanity than a final destination. In reality, of course, just as people have forever carried on their lives in the fields of their entanglements with others, so also they have always inhabited an environment including manifold, non-human, as well as human constituents. Social life has always been part and parcel of ecological life, if indeed the two can be sensibly distinguished at all. It's a peculiarity of life lived under the rubric of society, however, that relations with non-humans are construed to lie on the far side, in a world of primordial potentialities rather than instituted finality. Not only then do the inhabitants of society have to find their way through the maze of conclusions that various times have offered to history, they also have to piece together the many alternative presentations of origins that can be glimpsed on the other side, each going by the name of nature, and each claiming a timelessness and universality particular to its age and place. All of this goes to show that the concept of nature, like that of society, is inherently and intensely political. It is invariably bound up in a politics of claim and counterclaim, whose outcome depends upon the prevailing balance of powers. Yet even when configured by the institutions of society, the life of human beings is not carried on in a world of its own, beyond the edge of another world of nature, wherein the lives of all non-humans are contained. Rather, all creatures, human and non-human, are fellow passengers in the one world in which they all live. And through their activities, they continually create the conditions for each other's existence. It may be true that throughout the world, humans have decisively influenced the conditions under which other creatures live their lives. But the environment is always work in progress, and among its producers must be included every agent that contributes in one way or another to its formation. Human beings certainly, but also animals of virtually every other kind, as well as plants and fungi, the wind and rain, glaciers, rivers, and the ocean. Of course, their relative contributions vary greatly, both geographically and over time. But my point is that an environment that has been prominently shaped by human activity, a garden, say, or a swidden pot, or a dwelling house, is on that account no more artificial, no more of a construction, than one that shows no signs of human presence at all. It's just that the principal produces a different in each case. Nor, since the process of production did not begin with the arrival of humans, and indeed has no discernible point of origin, nor is one environment any less natural than another. So human social life is not cut out on a separate plane over and above that of nature, but is part and parcel of a process that is going on throughout the organic world, comprised of the interplay of diverse human and non-human beings in their mutual entanglement. But if beings can foster each other's development, they can also act to block it by removing or subverting the conditions of growth. History brings pain and suffering as well as growth and prosperity. Neither is the monopoly of humans or non-humans. That humans regularly inflict pain and suffering on other humans, not to mention non-humans, is all too obvious. But it is worth bearing in mind that a great deal of the distress of non-humans is attributable to other non-humans, and that humans can actually suffer at the hands or feet or claws of non-humans too. Perhaps the infliction is less deliberate, but it is no less real in its consequences. How then can we rethink the environment in a way that gives priority to inhabitation, in a way that lets humans and other creatures be? We could, I think, make a start by rethinking the organism itself. And let's take a hint from the Bartek people, who are hunters and gatherers of the Malaysian rainforest. The Bartek, according to their ethnographer, Tako Lai, says that plants walk just as people do. And this sounds a bit strange to us, but only because we have a different understanding of movement. We accept that animals move, but plants surely stay put, rooted in the earth. For the Bartek, however, it is precisely in the roots that the plant's movement is to be found. This movement is not, as we might think of it, a displacement of an already completed object from one location to another, as I might move a chess piece across the board or this bottle of water across the table. It is rather an issuing forth along a line of growth. So when roots grow, their tips issue forth, leaving a trail behind them. The same happens in Bartek understanding when people walk along. They move along and leave a trail behind them. The wind, too, leaves a trail as it blows, and the sun as it makes its way across the sky. Everything follows its particular path. Perhaps then, we should describe the organism not as a self-contained, bounded object, but as a line, or better, a whole bundle of lines that continually overflow any boundaries we might draw around it. Even Darwin, steeped as he was in the traditions and prejudices of Western thought, was not so far from the Bartek view in his observation, to which I've already referred, of the entangled bank. But in a tangle of root systems, such as is often exposed along a bend of a river where the current undercuts the wooded bank on one side, how can we possibly draw a line around any tree so as to separate it from its environment? Indeed, the environment might be better understood as a zone of entanglement. Within the tangle of interlaced trails or fibers, continually raveling here and unraveling there, organisms grow or issue forth along the lines of their relationships. In a paper published in 1976, the great Swedish geographer Torsten Hägerstrand imagined every constituent of the environment, including, as he said, humans, plants, animals, and things all at once. Everything's having a continuous trajectory or line of becoming. As they move through time and encounter one another, the trajectories of diverse constituents are bundled together. Seen from within, writes Hägerstrand, or if we would say from an inhabitant perspective, one could think of the tips of trajectories as sometimes being pushed forward by forces behind, and sometimes having eyes looking around and arms reaching out at every moment asking, what shall I do next? These trajectories, he continues, are the threads of the big tapestry of nature, which history is weaving. In much the same vein, Theodosius Dobzhansky is one of the architects of the so-called new synthesis of 20th century evolutionary biology, liked to describe life as a process of groping, literally pervading everything so as to try everything, and trying everything so as to find everything. Life will not be contained within a boundary, but rather threads its way through the world along the myriad lines of its relations, probing every crack or crevice that might potentially afford growth, a movement. Nothing, it seems, escapes its tendency. Nevertheless, human history, and above all the history of the Western world, is studied with coercive attempts to suppress the unruly meanderings of inhabitants, both human and non-human, by covering over the tapestry they weave with an infrastructure of hard and impervious surfaces. Engineered roads now crisscross the lands of the Bartek, crushing their trails of life in the name of sustainable forestry. All around the world, governments and corporations have caused banks once entangled with vegetation to be bulldozed to clear space for highways, airstrips, power lines, and industrial complexes. To an ever-increasing extent, the surface world has become, much as Kant and subsequent theorists of modernity imagined it, a solid substratum for the enactment of a global drama. It's a world that can be occupied, but not inhabited. Colonial life, encapsulated in mobile vehicles as genes are embodied, rolls over this world rather than trekking through it. So the effect of hard surfacing is to enforce a rigid separation between the earth below and the air above, a separation long built into science itself in the disciplinary separation of meteorology from terrestrial ecologies and in the global distinction of the biosphere from the atmosphere. It's this separation, as I've shown, that forces scientists to look inside the organism for the impulse of life and to find it in the genes rather than, say, in the humdrum and well-known reaction of photosynthesis. Yet, without photosynthesis, there could be no life on Earth. Nor could there be life without the fungi and bacteria that decompose organic material for recycling as nutrients for further growth. Both reactions, photosynthesis and decomposition, bind earth, air and water across a permeable zone of interpenetration, known to our experience as the ground, where interpenetration is blocked by hard surfacing, neither photosynthesis nor decomposition can occur. Indeed, in a fully surfaced world, nothing could grow at all. Thinking of the environment from the perspective of habitation as a zone of entanglement which disrupts any boundary we might draw between the interiority of the organism and the exteriority of the world, gives us a way of situating the lived experience of engaging with our surroundings within the dynamics of the more encompassing systems of which these engagements are a part. And this is to make a start, at least, in closing the gap between the earth-sky world of our experience and the global environment of technoscience. It's to take the first step in designing environments alike. The second step is to reconsider the meaning of design itself. What can it mean to design things in a world that is perpetually under construction by way of the activities of its inhabitants, who are tasked above all with keeping life going, rather than with bringing to completion projects already specified at the outset? The answer, I suggested in earlier lectures for those who were there, is that design is not so much about innovation as about improvisation. It's to recognize that the creativity of design is to be found not in the novelty of prefigured solutions to perceived environmental problems, but in the capacity of inhabitants to respond with precision to the ever-changing circumstances of their lives. To equate creativity with innovation is to read it backwards in terms of its outcomes, rather than forwards in terms of the movements that gave rise to them. You start from a result in the form of a novel object and trace it through a sequence of antecedent conditions to an unprecedented idea in the mind of an agent. The idea is then taken to be the design for the object. To equate creativity with improvisation, by contrast, is to read it forwards, following the ways of the world as they unfold, rather than seeking to recover a chain of connections from an end point to a starting point on a route already travelled. In this sense, creativity implies growth. And growth, in turn, implies that the materials of which things are made are moving and active, rather than comprising a passive substrate upon which forms are imposed. Now, creative improvisation calls for both flexibility and foresight. It is important to stress that flexibility does not imply reversibility. One cannot, in any living system, go back and undo what has been done already. The essence of flexibility lies in the ability not only to find the grain of the world's becoming, the way it wants to go, but also to bend it to an evolving purpose. It's not then merely a matter of going with the flow, so one can give it direction as well. Designing for life is about giving direction rather than specifying endpoints. And it is in this regard that design involves foresight. And there is a critical distinction to be made between foresight and prediction. It has long been the conceit of planners and policymakers, or of those entrusted with projects and development, to suppose that to imagine the future is to predict. That is, to conjecture a novel state of affairs as yet unrealized, and to specify in advance the steps that need to be taken in order to get there. Governments and other agencies demand what they call scenarios, images of what the world will look like, say, in 2050 or 100 years' time. To foresee, however, is to run ahead of things and to pull them along behind you, rather than to project by an extrapolation from the present, seeking not to speculate about the future, but to see into the future. It is to improvise a passage, rather than to innovate with representations of the unprecedented. It's to tell how things will go in a world where everything is not preordained, but incipient, forever on the verge of the actual. It's about opening up pathways, rather than setting targets. And critically, it involves the exercise of the imagination. The process of design could be compared to the act of drawing. Indeed, in many European languages, including French, Italian and Spanish, I don't know in the case of Portuguese, the words for designing and drawing are one and the same. French dessin, for example, is drawing or design. Paul Klee famously describes drawing as taking a line for a walk. The line that goes for a walk does not represent or prefigure anything, it simply carries on, tracing a path as it goes. The celebrated Portuguese architect Álvaro Siza once compared the designer to a novelist who, far from determining the plot, finds that his characters are constantly slipping away from him. It's all they can do to track them down. As a designer, Caesar still draws. However, the drawn line does not connect predetermined points, but breaks a trail, continually launching forth from its pitch, precisely as the geographer Heggestrand envisaged in his idea of groping life forms looking around, reaching out, and wondering where to go next. Travelling life, unencumbered by the dead weight of heavy materials, the line of the designer or architect is one that gives chase to the phantasms of a fugitive imagination and reins them in before they can get away, setting them down as signposts in the field of practice that builders or makers can track at their own more laboured and ponderous pace. So the designer, let us say, is a dream catcher. And if there's a distinction between design and making, it is not between projects and their implementation, but between the pull of hopes and dreams and the drag of material constraints. It's here where the reach of the imagination meets the friction of materials, or where the forces of ambition rub up against the hard edges of the world. It is here that human life is lived. The difference between plans and projects on the one hand, and hopes and dreams on the other, is that the former anticipate final outcomes, whereas the latter do not. The verbs to hope and to dream are not transitive, like to make or to build, but intransitive, like to dwell and to grow. They denote processes that don't begin here and end there, but carry on through. I suggest that in designing environments for life, we should treat to design, too, as an intransitive verb. It is in this sense that design is open-ended. Let me return to Paul Clay's contention with which I began, that form is death, but form-giving is life. In his celebrated creative credo of 1920, Clay declared that art does not reproduce the visible, but makes visible. I mentioned this in my lecture yesterday. By this he meant that it does not seek to replicate forms that are already settled, whether as images in the mind or as objects in the world. It rather seeks to join with those very forces that bring form into being. So the drawn line grows from a point set in motion as the plant grows from its seed. Like drawing, designing is also a process of growth. And like the growing plant, design unfolds within constantly transforming life conditions. Design in this sense does not transform the world, it's rather part of the world transforming itself. And this process of self-transformation, I would say, unfolds along not one, but many paths. It is in essence a conversation. Like life, conversations carry on. They have no particular beginning point or end point. No one knows in advance what will come out of them, nor can their conduct be dictated by any one partner. They are truly collective achievements. Let us then think of the process of designing environments for life as a conversation, embracing not only human beings, but all the other constituents of the life world, from non-human animals of all sorts to things like trees, rivers, mountains, and the earth. This is a conversation that is not only processual and open-ended, but also fundamentally democratic. So I began with the promise that I would come up by the end of this lecture with a design manifesto. So here it is, in 3 clauses. First, environments are inherently variable, therefore design should enhance the flexibility of inhabitants to respond to these variations with foresight and imagination. Second, the impulse of life is to keep on going. Design unfolds within constantly transforming life conditions and should open up pathways for creative improvisation. Third, there is always a tension between hopes and dreams for the future and the material constraints of the present. Therefore, design should invite people from all walks of life to join the conversation around this tension. Together, these clauses comprise my manifesto for the design of environments for life, and I commend it to you for your consideration.